Hi, I'm Electric Ashes, and in this video I'm going to reveal Kill la Kill, the animeest anime that ever animated. Seriously, if a normie tried to describe what an anime is, what they'll come up with will probably bear an uncanny resemblance to this. And while the main appeal of this show is obvious to all, I do believe it does have something to say about conformity and the follies of appeasing evil. Now, the setting of this show is Honnouji Academy, an authoritarian hellhole where your social standing is based on your academics. The higher-ranking students were all given Goku uniforms, special uniforms that grant the wearers superpowers. This is Ryuko Matoi. She is one of those tough girl archetypes who could easily beat up anything, and her father was murdered by a giant scissor blade, so Ryuko travelled to schools across the country to find the murderer. We have no idea why she would think that the murderer was a student, and we later find out that they had no connection to Honnouji Academy anyway. But if Ryuko doesn't go to this school, the story won't happen. She confronts the student council president, Satsuki Kirin, and demands to know if she knows anything about her father's murder. Satsuki decides to be as vague and unhelpful as possible. The president of the boxing club then intercepts Ryuko. The fight was ridiculously one-sided. Turns out Ryuko couldn't deal with superpowers, so she had no choice but to retreat. Back at the ruins that used to be her house, Ryuko was thrown into the basement. There she finds Senketsu, who forces itself on her. At the school, Mako Monk Kanshuk, a girl that Ryuko met earlier and her self-proclaimed bestie, was being held hostage to draw Ryuko out into the open. She leaps into the rescue, and now that she has superpowers of her own, she casually defeats the boxing club president. But due to Senketsu sucking too much of Ryuko's blood, she was forced to retreat. Again. She passes out, and when she woke up, she was at Mako's house and was effectively made a part of her family. Returning to school the next day, the tennis club president picks a fight with Ryuko. But she couldn't activate Senketsu and gets thrown out of the school. She wakes up at her homeroom teacher's apartment. Aikuro Mikasugi here seems oddly knowledgeable about Senketsu, revealing that it's called a Kamui. It was created by Ryuko's father, and it needs blood to activate it. But he refuses to tell Ryuko anything more until she defeats the tennis club president. And so once again, Ryuko leaps in to rescue Mako, and once again picks a fight with the tennis club president. But since they were on a tennis court, they had to play tennis. After the tennis club president was defeated, Satsuki personally challenges Ryuko. But Ryuko had to retreat again due to the whole wearing a blood-sucking monster thing. So despite the promise he made, Mikasugi still refuses to tell Ryuko anything she actually wants to know, and instead exposits about Kamuis and life fibers. Satsuki challenges Ryuko again and reveals that she has a Kamui of her own. And not only that, she can actually use Junketsu's full power. This was because unlike Ryuko, Satsuki had no sense of shame. But thanks to some encouragement from Mako, Ryuko was able to unleash Senketsu's full power and get her second wind. But it was too little too late and Satsuki defeats her. Satsuki then tells Ryuko that she will fight her again if she defeats all of the club presidents, and it was at that point the club presidents became narratively irrelevant. See, the first 3 episodes implied that this was going to be a Freak of the Week show, but each episode was going to have a club president that Ryuko will need to figure out how to defeat. However, Ryuko has just become so powerful that she could easily defeat a club president in less than 30 seconds. Hell, she could defeat several of them in a single episode. That's not to say they abandoned the Freak of the Week format. Yet. But instead of club presidents, episode 4 was about an obstacle course set up by one of the Elite Four, Gamaguri. Episode 5 introduces Kinagasi, an ally of Mikasugi who decides to go after Ryuko despite Mikasugi's protests. And episode 6 was a direct fight against the Elite Four member Sanageyama. Actually, I probably shouldn't just skim over episode 6 like that. After all, Sanageyama does go through some character development. So Sanageyama used to be something of an arrogant prick. He had this super sight ability that allowed him to keep track of anything. Ryuko defeats him by blinding him. Humbled by this, Sanageyama had his eyes sewn shut, and then he got heightened senses that allowed him to defeat Ryuko. But getting back to the club presidents, they only became relevant again in episode 7, and that's only because Ryuko forces Mako to become one. In this episode, Ryuko found out that practically all the clubs were being atomized into very specific things. This was because if a club president actually defeats Ryuko, they will get a higher rank and thus a higher standard of living. After discovering that where you get to live is directly tied to where you are in the school hierarchy, Ryuko gets the idea to game the system by starting a fight club. She then forces it on Mako once she finds out about all the paperwork that a club president has to do, as well as all the meetings they would have to attend. And I have to give some credit to Satsuki here. She does treat Ryuko's fight club like any other school club. The Kanshuk family do get special privileges for Mako's hard work. Granted, this was mainly because Satsuki was confident that the Munkunshuks would get assimilated into a tyrannical regime. It was only Ryuko that wasn't taken in by the upper-class lifestyle, which causes her to quit the club. Satsuki then gets Mako to fight Ryuko. Mako claims that she has to defeat Ryuko to maintain the new lifestyle that everyone enjoys, but Ryuko doesn't believe a word of that, pointing out that it was taking Mako way too long to defeat her. And so, Mako disbands the fight club, and the Munkunshuks were sent back to the gutter. Satsuki then decides to hold a student council election. This was probably because only the sewing club was left standing and she didn't want Ryuko to go after that. So all the students fight each other in a week-long battle royale while Satsuki hides behind a force field. Don't get too excited. Much like the club presidents, this battle royale is also narratively irrelevant. All the major characters didn't really care about the whole thing and they just left the school for the week. Since the only two people who claim to know anything aren't talking, Ryuko and Mako went back to the Matoi residence to see if there was any clues about Ryuko's father's murder or about what Senketsu is. Unfortunately, the place was wiped clean. The week passes and Satsuki then announces that all the fights were pointless, and the winners will be determined by whoever manages to get to the top of one of the 5 towers, which ends up being all the characters that actually have names. The Elite Four then request that the final challenge be consecutive fights against Ryuko. Satsuki agrees to their request and she tells Ryuko that if she defeats the Elite Four then she will tell her everything. For realsies this time. The fights against the Elite Four weren't going to start straight away, which gives Mikasugi a chance to talk Ryuko out of fighting. This was because he was concerned of what would happen to Ryuko and Senketsu if they were to fight all of the Elite Four. But now that he pointed out that she doesn't actually have to participate, I have to wonder, wouldn't it have made more sense for Ryuko to keep clear of the election entirely? You know, just stand back while everyone else fights each other, and then go straight for Satsuki when she no longer has anyone to defend her. After all, it's not as if Ryuko actually wants to be part of the student council. There was no need for her to make a spectacle of herself. But since Satsuki was promising to tell her everything and Mikasugi wasn't, Ryuko decides to go through with the fights. First opponent, Ira Gamaguri. Now Gamaguri showed his hand to Ryuko in the previous episode, and she knows full well that if she attacks him, he will just counter her, like a Wobbuffet. But unlike a Wobbuffet, Gamaguri is able to attack himself, which allows him to counter-attack anyway. So when Gamaguri is in attack mode, Ryuko could only defend against the onslaught. But while he's in defense mode, her attacks won't do anything to him, except make him more powerful in attack mode. Senketsu figures out how to defeat him. They get Ryuko to grab a hold of one of Gamaguri's whips when he changes back into defense mode. And once inside, Senketsu activates a new transformation, that allows Ryuko to tear apart Gamaguri's Goku uniform from the inside out. Gamaguri defeated, next opponent, Hoka Inamuta. So Ryuko accuses Inamuta of being a walking cliché.
There's only one way to beat you at this game, geekster! Get reckless!
Yeah, I have to disagree with her here. Super analytical characters like Inamuta is supposed to be usually come in 2 flavors. Firstly, there's the type who could figure out everything with very little information, such as figuring out someone's life story from something as innocuous as a cough. And then there's the other extreme, who are always in the antagonist role. The pattern will be that the antagonist will proclaim that they can win any sport/board game/monster battle, delete appropriate, using facts and logic. The protagonist will get outraged by this, insisting that feelings are all that matter. They will then engage in the sport/board game/monster battle, delete appropriate, and the antagonist will then be shocked at how unpredictable the protagonist is. Despite the fact the protagonist won't be doing anything they haven't done in every other episode. That's who Inamuta is, someone who couldn't predict the obvious. And the thing is, those other one-shot jerks who find the protagonist too unpredictable tend to have the excuse of only just meeting them. Inamuta, on the other hand, has supposedly been observing Ryuko since episode 1. Here's my observation of Ryuko's fights. Up until now, there were 3 occasions where she was defeated in a very definitive sense. There's the fight against Satsuki, but not only was Satsuki significantly stronger than everyone else, she was also wearing a Kamui rather than a Goku uniform. So there isn't really anything to glean from that fight. There's the fight against Sanagiyama, and it does seem that Inamuta was using him as the basis for his strategy. Except he was using pre-character development Sanagiyama, and Ryuko won that fight. And finally there's Kinagasi, and honestly this was the fight that Inamuta should have focused on. Unlike Ryuko's other opponents, Kinagasi doesn't use life fibers. Instead, he made use of relatively standard weapons. And his primary tactic was to have Ryuko chase him, and then she would run straight into the traps he set up in advance. Sure, he had those anti-life fiber needles, but what ultimately defeated Ryuko was a standard explosion. My point is, if Inamuta actually had analysed all of Ryuko's previous battles, he'd know that her primary weakness was anything that's not directly targeting her. Hell, the previous fight against Gamaguri demonstrated that Ryuko couldn't do anything against an opponent that was just flailing about wildly. Inamuta really should have adopted a strategy of hyper-aggression rather than passive reaction. Okay, to be fair, he does do the hyper-aggression thing after turning invisible. Then again, he stops short of actually pushing Ryuko out of the ring, which allows her to counter-attack. The big problem is, though, Ryuko wasn't even trying to be unpredictable. She was just being reckless, as if that's supposed to mean something. Bottom line, the defeat of super analytical villains is only satisfying if the hero does something that genuinely couldn't have been anticipated. Like surrendering, for example. Anyway, Inamuta forfeits the match under the pretense of not wanting to lose any of his data, even though he's clearly not using it for anything. Next opponent, Nonon Jakuzure. Now, if Jakuzure was the one who claimed to have analysed all of Ryuko's previous battles, I would believe her. First off, she can fly, which in of itself is a massive advantage over the ground-bound Ryuko. And secondly, she uses range attacks exclusively, so she never has to go anywhere near her. Ryuko tries to drag Jakuzure down to the arena, and although Jakuzure couldn't cut through Senketsu's threads, the arena itself wasn't indestructible. And so Ryuko falls off the arena. Fortunately, Senketsu activates a new transformation and now they can fly. With this new ability, Ryuko made a beeline for Satsuki, but Jakuzure intervenes and forces her back onto the arena. Ryuko catches one of Jakuzure's projectiles and throws it back at her. But Jakuzure's Goku uniform had a second stage transformation, and she fires her sound cannon at Ryuko. Ryuko was able to negate it and reflect the massive sound wave back at her. Inamuta described it as like being a tuning fork. Jakuzure defeated, next opponent Uzu Sanageyama. Except the writers apparently didn't want a third Sanageyama fight, and so they have Ryuko fight Nui Harame instead. So who is Harame anyway? Well, she's the one who killed Ryuko's father. Ryuko was naturally pissed. In fact, she gets so mad she transforms into this thing. Now that Ryuko was out of control, Kinagasi intervenes, but first thing he had to do was get Harame out of the way. He did this with his tried and true method of luring his target into a trap. With everyone out of the way, Mikasugi prepares to headshot Ryuko. But he couldn't pull the trigger, and so Kinagasi had to detonate more explosives to prevent her from walking off. Satsuki enters the scene and she fights the Rage Monster. But before she could finish Ryuko off, Mako gets between them and gives Ryuko the come to your senses slap. Ryuko returns to normal and passes out from blood loss. When she recovered and the school was repaired, she confronts Satsuki again, demanding to know where Harame is. Satsuki lies to her and claims that Harame was just a minion acting under her orders, and that she will still need to defeat her to avenge her father. So Satsuki was preparing a school trip, Mako gets conscripted, and Ryuko was traumatized by the whole turning into a rage monster thing. A student named Shinjiro Nagita tries to convince Ryuko to wear Senketsu again to fight against Satsuki, but Ryuko refuses, and I can't say I blame her. I mean, even if she didn't lose the will to fight, Ryuko has never been portrayed as the champion of justice type. The only reason she fought for club presidents was because both Mikasugi and Satsuki claimed that if she did, they will tell her who killed her father. Now that Ryuko knows who the killer is, she doesn't really have a reason to stay at Tenoji Academy. And frankly, her going there was based on rather flimsy logic to begin with. But after witnessing Nagita getting oppressed by the disciplinary committee, Ryuko was inspired to don Senketsu again and stand up against Satsuki's tyranny. Unfortunately, the whole thing turned out to be a ruse. Harame made the whole thing up because she wanted Ryuko to turn into a rage monster again. When Ryuko refused to play along, Harame kills Senketsu, and she would have killed Ryuko too if Satsuki didn't intervene. And so Satsuki takes the pieces of Senketsu and distributes them amongst her best troops. When Ryuko regained consciousness, she finds out that Senketsu was still alive, and she goes after the school trip to recover its pieces. It's at this point that Satsuki effectively usurps Ryuko's role as main character. On this school trip, Gamaguri was sent to Kobe, Jakuzure was sent to Kyoto, and Sanageyama was sent to Osaka. Gamaguri's and Jakuzure's squads were able to defeat the schools they were sent to conquer. But Sanagayama's squad faced increased resistance since not only were they fighting against a rival school, but all the residents of Osaka. It got so bad that Satsuki needed to personally intervene. With a single slash, he was able to get rid of Takawada's entire army. Takawada responds to this with a giant crab mech. Not that it does him much good. And things got even worse for him when the Elite Four received their improved Goku uniforms, which results in him... So the creators of this show have admitted that they couldn't figure out why Takawada was so popular with Americans. While I can't speak for anyone but myself, I think I can point out where Studio Trigger went wrong. See, Takawada was clearly supposed to be a hate-sink character. He's loud, obnoxious, ugly, egotistical, and has a callous disregard for his home and his people. And we were supposed to cheer when he gets humiliated and punished. The problem is, he's in the exact same scene as Satsuki Kirin, and Satsuki has been far too effective at being a villain. Sure, people tend to view jerks as being worse than villains, but one of the reasons why is because jerks and villains never share the same scene. And compared to Satsuki, Takawada hasn't actually done anything worthy of contempt. Satsuki and Sanagayama condemn him because he would rather sacrifice his people and his city instead of just surrendering. But this condemnation rings rather hollow because up until episode 12, Satsuki has shown a similar disregard for her students' lives and for her school. When it comes down to it, the only difference between these two is that Takawada believes in the carrot while Satsuki believes in stick. And that's only if you consider Takawada to be a villain at all. That's the core problem, really. He hasn't actually done anything particularly villainous. He's not planning to take over the world, and he's not forcing anyone to follow his ideology. The only thing we've seen him do was resist Satsuki's invasion, and from what we've been shown and told, opposing Satsuki is a good thing. It wouldn't be too difficult to view Takawada as a hero, and it's in that context that all of his negative traits come off as endearing instead of contemptible. So anyway, it turns out Satsuki wasn't really interested in Takawada at all. She just wanted to know the location of the resistance group that he was funding. And then Ryuko shows up to claim the last piece of Senketsu. All that's left was the glove, and without it Ryuko can't transform. Except, she didn't get the glove until episode 2. She was able to use Senketsu just fine without it in episode 1. And then the resistant group Nudist Beach reveal themselves to back up Ryuko. While they keep the Elite Four busy, Ryuko risks an incomplete transformation to get the glove back from Satsuki. Again, she doesn't actually need the glove. With Senketsu completed, Ryuko was able to fight Satsuki to a standstill. She was able to get Satsuki to withdraw her forces, but it turns out that was only because Jakuzue destroyed Nudist Beach's hideout while everyone was distracted. And it's only now that Mikasugi decides to tell Ryuko everything. At the same time, Satsuki's mother, Wagyo Kirin, also exposits to her daughter. It turns out that cloves were evil alien parasites that were planning to consume the entire world. When Ryuko's father found this out, he formed Nudist Beach to oppose the Kirin family, who were trying to facilitate all of this, and he created Senketsu so that Ryuko could fight the life fibers. On Satsuki's end, a victory parade was planned that will end with the whole of Hono City sacrificed to the life fibers. The remnants of Nudist Beach find this out via the hidden cameras that Mikasugi left behind. But it turns out that Satsuki allowed the cameras to remain in place to bait Ryuko out. Ryuko's group didn't make it to the stadium in time and everyone gets wrapped up into a cocoon. Well, almost everyone. Ryuko prepares to fight Wagyo, but Wagyo gets stabbed in the back by Satsuki. Satsuki then releases everyone from their cocoons, have the Sewing Club freeze the primordial life fiber, and reveal that she created Honoji Academy to oppose Wagyo. It turns out Satsuki was only pretending to be evil so she could avenge the death of her father and her baby sister. And I have to wonder, just how much of the story was actually written down before the show was aired? Because it seems like the actual reason why Mikasugi and Satsuki didn't tell Ryuko the truth was because the writers hadn't figured that part out yet. Okay, so Mikasugi does actually have some good reasons to not tell Ryuko absolutely everything. But still, in the first episode, he could have gone up to her at the ruins of her house and say, "Hi, I work for your father and I can help you avenge his death." But Satsuki didn't really have a reason to be so antagonistic towards her. She could have just said, "Hi, I know who killed your father. She works for someone who killed my father. We should team up." Like I said earlier, Satsuki was too effective at being a villain, and that's probably because up until around episode 10 she was definitely a villain. I have no way of proving it, but I swear that when I first saw episode 1, it was definitely Satsuki's silhouette that was fleeing the scene, which would somewhat justify Ryuko going after her. But looking back at the scene, at least on the Blu-ray, the silhouette is a lot more ambiguous. The skirt is much wider than what Satsuki wears, and even though the hair is split in two, they are too small to be Harume's twin tails. The only evidence I have that a retcon has occurred is this specific frame in episode 11, where they tried to superimpose Harume onto Satsuki and failing miserably. And even if I'm completely wrong about that, we've seen how Satsuki acts when she wasn't in public, and she acted like a true believer in her own rhetoric. There was definitely nothing to imply that she was doing any of this for anyone but herself. Hell, her main criticism of Ryuko was that she had no greater ambition other than avenging her father. Only now we're told that Satsuki was no different from her. Which is a bit awkward when you consider that the narrative was telling us that Satsuki's strength was derived from her grand ambitions. Anyway, Satsuki's betrayal fails, the primordial life fiber breaks free, Rageo brainwashes everybody, and she finds out that Ryuko was her daughter. Ryuko was naturally pissed at the revelation, but there wasn't really any time to dwell on it as Satsuki blows up the entire stadium. A month passes and the whole world has gone to shit. Satsuki has been captured, Ryuko was comatose, and the last remaining resistance were having a hard time as they have very little to work with. Since, Jakuzue did such a thorough job at destroying Nudist Beach. Yeah, I'm not letting that go. Inamoto tries to claim that they couldn't have aligned themselves with Nudist Beach because they were trying to keep their motives a secret. But there was nothing stopping them from giving Rageo false reports. Just tell her that they've destroyed Nudist Beach and not actually do it. After all, it's not as if Rageo went to Osaka personally to verify the report, or demand someone's head as a trophy. She didn't really seem to have any sort of leash on Satsuki at all. Satsuki's heroic turn would have been much more convincing if she had lied to Rageo more often.
What are you doing?
Oh, I'm surrounded by the enemy too. Yeah, and I can't move. Can't help you either. Listen, call back in an hour.
Anyway, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Iori, the president of the Sewing Club, has invented a suction cannon which frees captured humans from evil clothing, which were quickly proven redundant as Ryuko could free multiple people at once. So Ryuko's back and she's pissed at the fact that she's not human. And this is another trope in fiction that I'm not a fan of. Whenever a character finds out they're not human and angst over the revelation, I can't help but think, what has actually changed? Although, unlike other examples, it's not as if the whole not being human thing was the only thing she's mad about. And it didn't help that Rageo and Harume were egging her on. They tell her to come back to Honoji Academy if she wants to kill them. And although it's clearly a trap, Ryuko doesn't care anymore and she walks straight into it. Inamuta hacks into Honoji Academy's security system and they discover that Satsuki was still alive. With this revelation, the Nudist Beach secret base sets sail. So Ryuko breaks in and fights Harume. The Mighty Five shoots at Rageo from their helicopter, and after hearing all the commotion outside, Satsuki breaks out with her fake toenail. Ryuko stabs Harume, but she doesn't die because she's made out of life fibers. And it turns out that she's also Ryuko's sister. Rageo springs her trap. During the fight, Harume sewn life fibers into Ryuko's body, so that she would be forced to wear junkets. Rageo then brainwashes her. Again. But this time Ryuko's memories were altered to make her think that Rageo was a good mother. The protagonists, I don't want to call Satsuki or the Elite Four heroes, regroup on the Nudist Beach ship. But they didn't have time to recuperate as the brainwashed Ryuko leaps onto the deck. Kinagasi tries to fight her, but she was too powerful. But he did buy enough time for Satsuki to don Senketsu. And not only was Satsuki able to transform with Senketsu, she was also able to use all of its abilities. But Ryuko quickly figures out that Satsuki wasn't using Senketsu properly. Since Satsuki can't hear Senketsu like Ryuko could, she had to yell out what she wanted it to do. But Satsuki never planned to actually defeat Ryuko. She was using herself as a decoy to get her in front of a suction cannon. Unfortunately, it doesn't work since Junketsu was stitched onto Ryuko's body. Harume joins the battle and Satsuki considers this a good thing. After all, the fact that they didn't trust Ryuko with the other half of the scissor blade means that the brainwashing can be undone. The Elite Four take on Harume while Satsuki goes after Ryuko. She makes an opening so that Mako can stuff Senketsu into Ryuko. The brainwashing was broken and Ryuko forces Junketsu off. Harume gets her hands on both scissor blades, but she wasn't able to kill Senketsu again. With Ryuko and Senketsu back together, they were able to chop off Harume's arms. But before they could finish Harume off, Rageo's assistant, Homaru, bails her out. The clothes monsters that she left behind were easily defeated. With all the life fibers they've recovered, Iori gets to work at repairing Junkets and remaking the Goku uniforms. Satsuki then gathers everyone to reveal Ragyo's endgame. She was planning to fly the primordial life fiber to Honoji Academy. Once it gets there, a signal will be sent out to all the life fibers commanding them to cover the entire planet. Afterwards, the planet will explode, sending the life fibers all over the universe so they can find their next victim. To stop this, Ryuko and Satsuki fly off to fight Ragyo, while everyone else heads to Honoji Academy to destroy the transmitter tower. Unfortunately, the ship was attacked, first by missiles and then by a giant clothes monster. Mako defeats the monster with her new Goku uniform and a whole bunch of suction cannons. But the primordial life fiber sends out a bunch of drop pods to overwhelm her with sheer weight of numbers. Worse still, the primordial life fiber anchors itself to the ship so it could eat everybody. Luckily, the Elite Four get their new Goku uniforms to turn the tide. Meanwhile, the sisters were having a difficult time fighting their mother, but Ryuko has a cunning plan. She charges straight for Ragyo, and then she dies. So Satsuki charges straight for Ragyo, and she doesn't fare much better. But it was all a distraction. Ryuko faked her death so that she could dive straight into the primordial life fiber to destroy its core. With the Elite Four joining the fight against Ragyo, Mikasugi orders everyone off the deck as he plans to ram the ship into the primordial life fiber's core. With the help of Mako and all the other club presidents powering the ship, Ryuko destroys the core, killing the primordial life fiber. Despite that, Harame finished making Shinra Kuntets, a new Kamui for Ragyo. Ragyo rewards her with new arms that were made for combat. The students try to destroy the transmitter, but it's behind a force field. Meanwhile, Ryuko fights Harame while Satsuki fights Ragyo. But since we've done this song and dance before, Ragyo just paralyzes everybody and disables their powers. What's worse, the primordial life fiber wasn't as dead as everyone thought it was, and it came back to eat everybody with only Mako and the Elite Four surviving because Gamaguri could still barely move. Harame, annoyed by the continued existence of the main characters, tries to kill everybody, but Ryuko manages to stop her. She got out of the paralysis by taking Senketsu off. Ragyo taunts Ryuko by showing her where to attack to turn off the absolute submission field, the thing that was paralyzing everyone and disabling superpowers. Ryuko doesn't have much luck at hitting the target. But Senketsu, after finding out that Satsuki can now hear it, was able to transform independently and destroy it. With everyone back in action, the students go after the transmitter, only to get intercepted by Harame and her clones. During this fight, Gamaguri destroys the force field and opens a hole in the transmitter. And then Nudist Beach launches their machine into the hole, blowing the whole thing up. Ryuko and Satsuki then chop Ragyo to bits, but even this wasn't enough to stop her as she orders Harame to kill herself. Harame was then absorbed into the primordial life fiber, which in turn gets absorbed by Ragyo. She then flies up to the satellite to activate the life fibers to absorb humanity and cover the world. The only way to stop her now was for everyone to give their life fibers to Ryuko so she can transform into Super Ryuko. She gives chase to Ragyo and confronts her. Unfortunately, the scissor blades were useless since they were made of hardened life fibers and the absolute submission field was back in effect. Things looked bad as Ragyo impales Ryuko, but this allowed Senketsu to absorb Shinra Kuntets, which gave Ryuko control of the absolute submission field. With every life fiber under her control, Ryuko orders them to release the humans and to return to being normal clothes. With her plans completely ruined, Ragyo takes her own life. And then Senketsu starts to fall apart. It turns out that absorbing the absolute submission field was too much for it. And so, with the last of its strength, it protects Ryuko from the re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. The students of Honoji Academy unite to cushion Ryuko's fall. About 44 days later, everyone was leaving Hono City since it was pretty much destroyed in the battle and whatever was left was going to sink into the ocean. Satsuki seems to be feeling very melancholic, which is strange when you consider that she has effectively achieved total victory. She's acting as if there's nothing left for her to do, which isn't really true at all. At minimum, she rules over the Keihashing region, if not the entire world. Plus, the baby sister that she was trying to avenge turns out to be still alive, so it's not as if they could do the whole emptiness after completed vengeance routine. And if Satsuki was just feeling guilt over what she did to get here, well, I don't buy it since, as I said earlier, it felt like her character was replaced rather than developed. In fact, here is the Satsuki from the first 10 episodes, and she is here to get revenge for being cut from the show. But in all seriousness, Homaru gathered what remaining life fibers she could find, and created clones of Satsuki and the Elite Four. They were based on the memories of the No-Star students that were terrorized by the originals. Homaru also captured Satsuki and Mako to power up the school, which turns out to have been a giant robot this entire time. Ryuko fights the Satsuki clone while the Elite Four fight their counterparts, but it doesn't go well for them since the clones have Goku uniforms and Kamuris while the originals don't. So Mako gives an inspirational speech about how real people are much better than imaginary people, and this gives everyone a second wind that allows them to defeat the evil clones. But they still have the giant robot to deal with. From beyond the grave, Senket summons the Scissor Blades, and Ryuko uses them to destroy the robot. With her plans in ruins, Homaru charges at Satsuki, and all she manages to do is cut some of her hair. Satsuki then tells Homaru that if she becomes evil again, she wants Homaru to kill her. And for some reason this convinces Homaru not to kill her. With the graduation ceremony finished and what's left of the academy sinking to the bottom of the ocean, everyone leaves and lives happily ever after. So when I decided to review this show, I thought I was going to talk about how a serious point could be missed due to superficial presentation. You know, how some people would dismiss this show solely because of the obvious fan service. But when I actually sat down to analyse the story... Look, I'm not going to say that the writers just phoned in the ending, but let's be real here. The 24th episode had stuff in it that would be cited as major storytelling flaws in any other show. New abilities that came out of nowhere, killing of characters just to bring them back literally seconds later. The only reason a show like Kill la Kill could get away with that sort of thing was because it happens to be a comedy. But what bothers me is that apparently everything becomes a more realistic world once everything is over. All the absurdist, exaggerated elements simply disappear, and I feel that the end credits of episode 24 doesn't really take into account the events of the show. Satsuki should not be walking around in broad daylight like this, because if she's not the tyrant of the world, she should be arrested for being a war criminal. Let's get into the characters. First, Ryuko Matoi. I've noticed that some reviewers of Western media have been complaining about the idea of small girls beating up men that are much bigger than them. They act as if this hasn't been happening in fiction since... well, I want to say time immemorial, but my knowledge of fiction doesn't extend to that far back. I do know that it's been a thing since at least the 1970s, and it's not a particularly unusual trope in Japanese fiction. The only real difference is that when the Japanese portray a small girl as being super strong, they also give them an emotional weakness, such as being embarrassed when people view them as a girl, or being embarrassed that people don't view them as a girl. And as far as anime tough girls go, Ryuko has plenty of emotional weaknesses. She is usually compared to Shadow the Hedgehog, and while there are superficial similarities, personality-wise she actually bears more resemblance to Sonic. The Fleetway version of him, that is. Just like Fleetway Sonic, Ryuko projects bravado while in reality is a jumbled mess of insecurities. The main difference is that Ryuko was allowed to dwell on her shortcomings, since there is no company mandate for her to always be cool. And this allows her to open up to others in a way that Sonic, regardless of which incarnation, cannot. Another thing that makes Ryuko stand out compared to other anime tough girls is that she gets her ass handed to her, quite frequently in fact. By my count, Ryuko was defeated in about 10 out of 25 episodes, and 6 of those episodes were rather definitive defeats instead of having one defeat and one victory against the same opponent. I really need to emphasize this. All those defeats are to her benefit. The fact that Ryuko wasn't completely unstoppable made her later victories all the more meaningful. Honestly, Ryuko was the best character in the show. Her journey from snarky hothead to hero of the world just felt natural, especially when compared to her sister's development. As for Senket, considering it is a piece of clothing that can only communicate with one other character, there was really not much it could do except give power and exposit to Ryuko. But I did love its moments of helplessness, like in episode 4 for example.
I'm being murdered! Help! You maniac! Why don't you watch where you're driving? Ow, that hurts! Don't bite so hard, you vile hellhound!
Now, Mako Monkonshuk. I imagine that she will be a polarizing character, being loud comic relief. Some will appreciate her, others will find that she takes up too much screen time. Me personally, I don't mind her that much. However, when it comes to comic relief, I found the Monkonshuk men to be far more amusing. Though I think we can all agree that Mako did a great job as Ryuko's emotional crutch. She isn't one of those comic relief characters that was such a hindrance you start to wonder why the protagonist would have anything to do with them. Hell, she actually bails Ryuko out of some of her more desperate situations. Aikuru Mikasugi is a character I didn't really care for, but I imagine that he will be controversial to some people given his perverted nature. The only saving grace is that Ryuko doesn't put up with his harassment, and it doesn't help that, despite being the main source of exposition, he refuses to say anything important until it was arguably too late. And even when he did give important information, it was impossible to tell if he was being serious or not. To round up the primary good guys, we have Tsumugu Kinagase. He made a strong showing in his debut, being able to go toe-to-toe with a Kamui without using life fibers himself. But like a video game boss who becomes playable later, he was much more effective as an adversary than as an ally. He did have something of a tragic backstory, but I don't think it was ever really resolved. His story arc basically amounted to he wants to kill Senketsu, and then he suddenly decides not to. All in all, he was a very wasted character. Now for the villains. So I was never a fan of Satsuki's switch from villain to hero. She was great as a villain, but when they made her one of the heroes, the writers seemed to bend over backwards to avoid giving her any sort of comeuppance for her past villainy. The biggest problem I had was that if Satsuki was against Ragyo the entire time, then it essentially meant that her plan to oppose Ragyo was to do everything that she wanted, and then act surprised when she wins. But that's all based on the assumption that the story was actually planned out. Now that I suspect that they changed Satsuki's character in episode 12, it would explain why there were no hints of her upcoming betrayal. The only thing I can think of that would even imply that Satsuki wasn't on Ragyo's side was at the very beginning of the show, she had a student killed for trying to steal a Goku uniform. Satsuki was trying to keep the life fibers under her exclusive control while Ragyo would have wanted them to spread. There was also that flashback where Satsuki saved a bully kid from killing himself. But honestly, based on how they portrayed Satsuki up to that point, I would have believed that she just wanted to spite the bullies rather than save the kid. If Satsuki was truly supposed to be a hero the entire time, the writers really should have given us more hints, because I feel like I was grasping at straws with those two examples. Of course, to fully explain the problem with Satsuki, I will have to also talk about Ragyo, the character who took her place as the main villain. She didn't leave much of an impression on me. Her tone and expressions rarely changed throughout the show, even treating being crucified as a minor annoyance. From what I can recall, it wasn't until episode 20 that she starts to display other emotions besides smug superiority. And the fact that she was very hands-off as a villain made things awkward when Satsuki betrays her. The only reason we had to hate her at that point was that she was the head of the Kyoins, which would be all well and good if it weren't for the fact that almost all of the atrocities we've seen the Kyoins commit were all Satsuki's initiatives. For comparison's sake, let's take a look at Darth Vader and the Emperor. Without the context of the prequel trilogy, the Emperor was such a flat character that he didn't even have a name. And despite having very little in characterization, we could easily infer what the Emperor's defeat would actually mean for the galaxy. By contrast, it wasn't exactly clear what Ragyo actually does or what a defeat would entail. Being the head of Revox doesn't really mean much unless you're one of those people who thinks being rich is inherently evil. And being Satsuki's mother doesn't really mean much either, since the show established itself as an adults-do-nothing affair from the very beginning.
Mr. Principal, the student council are animals. Do something.
This doesn't concern us, so stay out of it. Kiryuin's mother is the chair of the Academy's board of directors. Therefore, Lady Satsuki is our lord and master. We work for her, so there's nothing we can do about it.
Ragyo herself seemingly followed this unwritten rule by the fact that it took her 3 episodes for her to even ask Satsuki why she took Junketsu. And in general, she seems to have a very blasé attitude towards her daughter's antics. It wasn't until after Satsuki destroyed Osaka that the writers even bothered to give us a reason to hate Ragyo. Obviously, we could have inferred that she had something to do with life fibers, but life fibers weren't really portrayed as anything but a source of power before the show told us they were evil aliens. The destruction of Alderaan made it clear why the Emperor needed to be deposed of, even before the character was properly introduced. As for Satsuki, like Darth Vader, she was the face of the villain team and is treated as the biggest roadblock to the hero's victory. As I pointed out, the majority of evil acts committed in the show can be laid directly at Satsuki's feet. She conquered multiple schools, destroyed Osaka wholesale, experimented and tortured her students, as well as endangering their lives both directly and indirectly. The only thing she wasn't responsible for was the inciting incident of Dr. Matoi's murder. By comparison, despite his presence, Darth Vader wasn't the only one being evil. The capture of Princess Leia, the destruction of Alderaan, those were all Tarkin's ideas. And let's not forget that the Death Star itself was the Emperor's brainchild. And even though Vader was also planning on betraying the Emperor, the Star Wars movies never tried to claim that he was a good guy the entire time. He needed to be convinced to do his heroic turn in Return of the Jedi. And then he died. That's the main sticking point, really. That Satsuki did such horrible things for around 2/3 of the show, and by the end got out relatively unscathed. Let's get into the Elite Four. Due to how the show was set up, only half of them were characterized well. Ira Gamaguri was the head of the disciplinary committee. The nature of his job allows him to regularly interact with other students, and thus it gave him the most screen time out of the four. And being the first villain introduced, he made a great first impression. It was clear from the start that he would be a stickler for the rules. But despite being the straight man to the wackier characters in the show, he was not humorless. When he was chasing his quarry, it was clear that he was enjoying himself. He even encourages his victims to put up resistance. Interestingly, his flashbacks portray him as a rather noble person before joining up with Satsuki. Not that his personality changed much after joining her. I'm just bringing this up because, if one was feeling generous, that could be interpreted as a third piece of evidence of Satsuki not really being a villain. However, I don't feel generous in regards to Satsuki, so I interpreted those flashbacks as moral weakness on Gamaguri's part rather than proof of Satsuki's virtue. That he would throw away his principles if their opposition was too great. Uzu Sanagayama was the head of the athletics committee. When Kill la Kill was pretending to be a Freak of the Week show, all the club presidents were in charge of athletics clubs. So tangentially, he was also involved with their schemes. He was the only bad guy that actually had a character arc. A hothead that only really cared for his own achievements, was humbled, and once he dedicated himself fully to Satsuki, he achieved his full potential. I would submit this character arc as proof of my theory that Satsuki wasn't pretending to be evil at the beginning of the show, and it was just something that the writers came up with later. See, when Sanagayama was defeated by Ryuko, he needed to mutilate himself to prove his resolve and get back into Satsuki's good graces. When Gamaguri was defeated by Ryuko, and he actually lost his resolve by the way, Satsuki intervened and was like, "No, life is precious!" Nonon Jakuzue didn't get much in the way of characterization since she was the head of the non-athletics committee. And by the time the non-athletics clubs went after Ryuko, the show stopped pretending that those guys were any kind of threat. What we did get from Jakuzue was devotion to Satsuki and snark at everything else. Not that she actually needed much more than that. Just saying that a satellite character like her requires another character around for them to bounce off of. And then there's Hoka Inamuta. I'm sure I've already made my feelings about him clear, but that one was based on just one fight. Let's take a look at his other battles. His first on-screen fight was when he subdued a student wearing an experimental 5-star uniform. Certainly a strong showing. His next battle was against Ryuko. I've already got into that fight, but I would like to add that the whole not wanting to lose data thing sounds like massive cope. What data did he even get from that fight? Unlike Gamaguri and Jakuzue, Inamuta didn't force an evolution from Senketsu. That giant eye thing doesn't count. After that, he intervened in Jakuzue's raid on Abikamo Academy, and disabled their magic. Then the Elite Four stopped nudist speech from intervening in Ryuko's and Satsuki's battle, although I have no idea what Inamuta actually did. Seriously, these two frames seem to be the full extent of his involvement in that battle. Next, after Satsuki's betrayal, the Elite Four tried to fight Harame. But once again, Inamuta didn't seem to actually do anything. Since he was the only member of the Elite Four not to be part of the Mighty Five, the next fight Inamuta was actually involved with was against the brainwashed Ryuko. And all he did then was push a button. Then the Elite Four got their ultimate Goku uniforms and they fought the clothes monsters on the nudist beach ship. Considering the previous battles that involve all of the Elite Four, I had to go back to check if Inamuta actually did anything this time. To his credit, he did. Only against the mobs though. He didn't do anything against Ragyo. His only role was to return Satsuki's weapons to her. When the Elite Four had to destroy the transmitter, Inamuta did take a couple of potshots against Harame. And finally, when Inamuta had to fight his clone, like the rest of the Elite Four, he was initially defeated. And then he remembered that he has an on-off button. Look, I'm not saying Inamuta was useless. I'm saying he's completely redundant. He was barely involved with the fights, and outside of battle, his only job was exposition. When it comes down to it, everything that Inamuta did could have easily been done by Iori. Speaking of, the Sewing Club president Shiro Iori, a character that didn't get much focus despite being the most important person in Satsuki's regime. After all, he was the one who creates the Goku uniforms, he created most of the anti-life fiber devices, and he was the one to sew Sanagayama's eyes shut. There was only one issue I had with Iori when I first watched this show, but now I'm in two minds about it. See, he was initially presented as a 2-star student, but when he was tasked to recreate all of the Goku uniforms, he reveals that he had 3 stars the entire time. At first I found this to be a complete arse pull. For one thing, Iori's uniform doesn't follow the same design aesthetic as their other 3-star uniforms, but mainly I felt that using superpowers undermines his sewing abilities. But on reflection, it would make sense for Iori to hide his rank. This isn't one of those situations where the only explanation for the character's actions is that they were trying to keep secrets from the audience. Iori needed to hide his identity because of Satsuki's plan. Naturally, he needed to be a high enough rank to justify being close to the upper echelons of the hierarchy. But he couldn't be the same rank as the Elite Four, or someone would have noticed he wasn't present at Ragyo's victory parade. Then again, would it really make sense for someone who knows the truth about life fibers to personally make use of them? After all, he wears a mask specifically so he doesn't accidentally inhale stray life fibers. Hell, the entire sewing club were wearing hazmat suits. Nui Harame was a character that was probably created once the writers decided to make Satsuki a secret hero. I like her. Her peppy and self-indulgent attitude made a great contrast to Satsuki's humorless personality and grand ambitions. She certainly made an impression in her introduction. She usurped Satsuki's tournament and actually made her panic for the very first time. And it wasn't just Satsuki either. Harame's entire thing was throwing people off balance. Be it not knowing who Sanagayama was, seeing straight through Inamuta's cloaking, and then there's Ryuko. Harame was the only villain that got into Ryuko's head in a way that no other adversary before her did. Whenever Ryuko got mad at Satsuki, her underlings, or Kinagase, it was either because she lost to them or because of some bureaucratic bullshit. Harame was the only one who ever made it personal. Because of this, it was a joy to see her break down when she lost her arms. Some people would have preferred it if she died by the hands of one of the heroes rather than sacrificing herself. But I'm of the opinion that the worst thing that the heroes could do to Harame was ignore her. Oh, one last thing. I was rather frustrated that we very rarely see her actually fight. When grabbing screenshots for this review, it turned out that most of her fights with Ryuko were just a black screen and effects. I suppose I should talk about Rei Homaru, since she is the villain of the OVA. But really, what can I say about her? She was a background character throughout most of the show. She bailed out Harame when she lost her arms. After that, Homaru became the weak spot of Shinra Kuntetsu, and then she came back for revenge because she wasn't killed off like everyone else in Revox. I suppose Homaru's revenge plot was the closest thing to comeuppance that Satsuki received in this show. After all, the revenge plot was only possible because Satsuki and the Elite Four were such dicks in the beginning. But honestly, it just seems rather hollow. I mean, I get that the clones were supposed to represent how much Satsuki and the Elite Four developed as characters, but I have to reiterate, it felt more like that Satsuki's character was replaced, not developed. Okay, let's get to the conclusion. I have to admit, I was surprised with myself when analysing this show. Going in, I knew I had issues with Satsuki and Inamuta, but I thought Kill la Kill would be a solid show regardless. It's probably because when I think back on this show, I usually remember the parts from before Satsuki's betrayal. The ending was never really on my mind. Having said that, this show was a jam-packed roller coaster. I hear other reviewers use the word spectacle as a pejorative when it comes to media, but really, why shouldn't entertainment be that transparent? Also, Kill la Kill really takes advantage of the medium of animation. Between Gamaguri always being the biggest thing on the screen, Harame being a fourth rule breaker, the exaggerated landscapes, and other examples of cartoon logic, we probably would have lost something if they tried to do this in any other medium. I would insist that anyone who calls themselves an anime fan, or is interested in getting into anime, to watch this, as a litmus test if nothing else. Anyway, thank you for watching. For my next review, let's do the exact opposite of spectacle. In fact, it's going to be a downright depressing anime involving the military's questionable conscription methods.